She had just committed 6 crimes right in front of the only man in America who could actually put her in prison. I mean, full-blown chaos, wood splintering, high-end heels clattering over shattered glass, the whole scene straight out of a movie. This woman, in her $1,000 blazer and reeking of sharp perfume that probably cost more than my truck payment, stormed into my grandfather's cabin yelling about rules and control like she owned the place. No idea who she was facing. No idea she was basically streaming her own arrest warrant live to 3,000 people. 6 months earlier, I thought Karen was just another bossy neighbor with too much time and too little sense. But no, she was secretly running a $4 million fraud operation, and I was about to wreck it by accident. So tell me, what would you do if some HOA maniac barged into your property in the middle of the most important meeting of your life? Drop a comment and let me know where you're tuning in from. I promise half of you know exactly what it's like to deal with these neighborhood tyrants. Let me back up and explain how this disaster even began. Half a year ago, life was honestly pretty great. My name's Marcus Henley, I'm 52, and after 3 decades of slogging through mud trenches, setting up power lines across 3 counties, I'd finally made it to retirement. My prized possession? My grandfather's fishing cabin at Clearwater Lake, 2 acres of pure paradise that Pop bought in 1963 for just $800. Can you believe that? $800 for lakeside land that's now worth more than most houses. It's no flashy mansion either, just hand-cut logs, a stone fireplace Pop built himself with rough, tired hands, and a porch that creaked in all the right ways. I'd kept it fully off-grid on purpose, solar panels buzzing on the roof, fresh well water that tasted like childhood, and a septic setup that outperformed most city systems. Every morning when the mist rolled off the lake, I was reminded exactly why Pop always said he didn't choose this spot, the land chose him. Marcus, he used to remind me, when someone's after your land, figure out why. Chances are it's worth a lot more than they're letting on. Wise man. And then she appeared. Delilah Cromwell, though everyone around here just called her the HOA Psycho, came crashing into our quiet lakeside like a storm wrapped in designer clothes. She was 58, straight out of some California subdivision where playing neighborhood tyrant must have been a full-time job. Drove a pearl-white Escalade with vanity plates that read Rule 1, I swear I'm not making that up, and pinned her HOA president badge to her jacket like it was a sheriff's star. She had one mission: turn our rustic getaway into her idea of a luxury resort. What I didn't realize at the time was that within 2 months of her arrival, 3 elderly couples had already sold their cabins to buyers. Convenient, right? Her opening move hit on a Tuesday. I was on Pop's porch sipping coffee, watching loons teach their chicks to dive, when I caught the sharp click of heels across my dock. Designer heels, at 7 in the morning, on my private dock. 10 minutes later, she was slapping an official-looking notice onto my screen door. A violation. Unsightly dock structure lowering property values. Fine, $500. Deadline for compliance set. Comply within 72 hours or daily penalties would pile up. I had to reread it just to be sure. My old dock, the same one Pop and I repaired together when I was 12, was now labeled an eyesore, dragging down the entire neighborhood's property values. Trying to be reasonable, I walked over to explain that my place was here long before the HOA even existed, nearly 40 years earlier. You know what she said, standing there in my driveway with her hands on her hips like a queen on her throne? Everyone on this lake answers to me, sweetie. Ask the Hendersons how fighting me turned out for them. The Hendersons, my elderly neighbors, who had suddenly decided to downsize just last month after more than 2 decades here. The dots weren't connecting yet, but I felt a chill in my gut. Then she started snapping photos like a property inspector, circling my cabin and aiming her phone at everything: my solar panels, my vegetable patch, even the porch rails my grandfather carved by hand. Meanwhile, the stench of her artificial car freshener drifted from her idling Escalade, making me nauseous. By the week's end, I had 3 more violation slips in my hand, each one steeper than the last. Each one a message that Delilah Cromwell wasn't just nitpicking, she was waging war on everything my family had built here. I still thought it was just a case of an overbearing neighbor, irritating but something I could handle. What I didn't realize was that I had just marked myself as a target in a game far bigger and far more dangerous than any neighborhood dispute. Pop's warnings rang in my ears. Find out why they want your land. I was about to learn the reason, and it would change everything. Karen didn't waste time pulling out heavy artillery. 3 days after the compliance deadline passed, because, let's be real, I wasn't tearing down Pop's dock for some self-appointed queen, I got a certified letter that turned my morning coffee bitter. Cease and desist. Violation of community waterway regulations. The letterhead read Blackstone Meyer and Associates, one of those polished firms where partners charge more in an hour than I earned in a month. The fine print claimed my dock illegally extended into the community waterway and demanded $3,000 in back violation fees. They also threatened to slap a lien on my property if I didn't pay within 10 days. My gut reaction? Panic. They had attorneys. I had a wrench set and a short temper. Then Pop's voice echoed in my head from those endless afternoons on the lake. Marcus, if someone's trying to lawyer you off your land, the truth is in the county records. Never trust their words. Find the papers yourself. So I headed to the courthouse, into that dusty basement where every important record ends up buried in old files. The clerk, Betty, sweet lady who still remembered Pop from his fishing tournament days, helped me dig up the original surveys. Union work had taught me this. Always check the source before letting a suit bury you with fancy stationery. What I uncovered lit a fire in me. Turns out my grandfather's lot didn't stop at the shoreline. It stretched 50 feet into the deed from 1963, stamped and official, said it plain as day. My grandfather's property line ran 50 feet into the lake. That dock wasn't trespassing on community space. It sat squarely in my water. And here's the kicker. The HOA hadn't even been formed until 1998, 35 years after Pop bought the land. I remembered an old foreman once telling me that older properties usually hold rights newer developments can't touch. Grandfathered exemptions, stronger than any neighborhood rule book. Armed with copies of those records, I headed back to the cabin feeling like I just won a round. That victory lasted right up until I tried to grab groceries and found Karen's Escalade parked sideways across my driveway. Not beside it, not nearby. Dead center, like she was running her own private checkpoint. I tapped on the glass and she lowered it just enough to sneer through the crack. Oh, Marcus, I'm just reviewing the community parking regulations. This might take a while. The drone of her idling engine mixed with the chemical sweetness of her air freshener created this surreal little bubble of passive-aggressive control. There I stood, a grown man who'd wired half the county's power lines, being boxed in at my own house by a suburban queen with a control addiction. And she wasn't even close to finished. Within a week, she had rolled out something called the Lakeside Beautification Committee. Sounds harmless, right? But in practice, it was a hit squad aimed at anyone who didn't match her upscale country club fantasy. Suddenly, neighbors who'd waved at me for decades were stepping off the road to avoid eye. Her Facebook posts became masterclasses in passive-aggressive warfare, all framed as concerns about unsightly properties dragging down everyone's home values. Hashtag Lakeside Strong. Hashtag Protect Property Values. The comments were a frenzy. Folks I'd known for decades suddenly turned into armchair lawyers, parroting Karen's talking points like she was some real estate prophet. A few neighbors quietly apologized to me. Tom and Susan Martinez caught me on my evening walk and admitted Karen had leaned on them hard, suggesting they file complaints against me or risk being buried under citations themselves. She'd already gone after old Mr. Peterson for non-regulation flower boxes and threatened the young couple with the newborn over their unsightly playset. "She's got dirt on everyone," Tom muttered, eyes darting like he expected Karen to leap out of the bushes with a camera. Then he added, "Her husband's up at the state capitol. Political ties." That chilled me straight through. This wasn't petty neighborhood squabbling anymore. She had reach. That night, I walked out to find orange spray paint smeared across my mailbox. Big, angry letters: "Comply or leave." My hidden solar-powered camera tucked behind a pine caught everything, right down to Karen's license plate at 2:30 a.m. When I reported it the next morning, guess who answered the call? Deputy Chad Cromwell, Karen's nephew. He glanced at the footage, shrugged, and muttered, "Probably kids. You know how they are." The gritty drag of that paint under my rag felt like sandpaper on my chest. Pop used to tell me, sometimes a bigger fight needs bigger weapons. Time to find them. Karen's next play came cloaked as civic duty, which somehow made it all the more infuriating. She'd realized direct attacks weren't breaking me, so she moved to weaponize the entire county bureaucracy against me. It started with a polite knock on my door from Building Inspector Dale Morrison, a guy I'd actually worked with on several projects over the years. The awkward look on his face told me everything I needed to know before he even opened his mouth. "Marcus, I'm real sorry about this, but I got a complaint about unpermitted structures on your property. You know I have to follow up on these things." 3 hours later, Dale had crawled through every inch of my cabin with his clipboard and measuring tape. His conclusion? Everything was not only up to code, but actually exceeded current safety standards. Pop might have been old school, but he'd built things to last. "Whoever filed this complaint," Dale muttered as he packed up his gear, "either doesn't know what they're talking about or they're just trying to waste everyone's time." The next day brought Environmental Officer Janet Bennett investigating reports of my septic system contaminating the lake ecosystem. Again, perfectly functioning. Better than most new installations, she admitted. Then Fire Marshal Bob Rodriguez showed up to examine my solar panels for hazardous electrical violations. Clean bill of health there, too. Each inspection cost me a day of peace and a chunk of my retirement sanity. But more importantly, each false report was creating an official paper trail that made me look like some kind of problem property owner. I remembered something my union rep used to warn us about. Bureaucratic harassment was a classic tactic because it looked legitimate on paper, even when it was pure malicious. While I was dealing with the inspection parade, Karen was busy playing her media game. She'd managed to get herself interviewed by Channel 7's Community Spotlight segment, positioning herself as this concerned citizen fighting to protect. She painted herself as the guardian of our family-friendly lake environment. The TV spot was a masterclass in selective editing, close-up shots that made my cabin look like a rundown shack, sound bites about supposed dangers to children, and a narrative casting her as a brave protector battling reckless homeowners. What made my blood boil was seeing her deliver that speech while standing on my dock, the same one she claimed was illegal, milking the cameras for all they were worth. Then came the buzzing of my phone, angry messages firing in from neighbors who'd swallowed her story. Half the lake now thought I was some kind of environmental threat. But then she slipped up. Greed. My old friend Jake Martinez from the Electricians Union rang me after seeing the broadcast. "Marcus, that lady's full of it, and everybody knows it. You built half the clean energy systems in this county. Hell, I use your solar setup as the example when I train apprentices." 2 days later, Jake had rallied 20 master electricians to swing by my place and personally vouch for my work. Funny how a parade of experts shuts down the hazardous installation lie in a hurry. That's when things took a turn. My high school buddy Chuck Davis, now a lawyer, dropped in for a beer and casually mentioned something that made me sit up straight. Marcus, the Attorney General's office is digging into HOA corruption cases around the state. Communities reporting the same kind of harassment you've been dealing with. I asked what kind of patterns, though I already had a sinking idea. Elderly homeowners buried under bogus citations, property values forced down, and buyers swooping in with cash. Every word struck home. It rang every damn bell I had. Chuck explained that these scams usually had someone with political pull running interference while the harassment drove out longtime residents. Once the owners caved, developers swooped in and flipped the land for huge profits. The AG's office is looking for witnesses, Chuck added, people with documentation who can prove the pattern. Someone like you could be exactly what they need. As his words sank in, the steady hum of my refrigerator suddenly felt deafening. Karen wasn't just a nosy, power-tripping neighbor. She was likely tied into something far bigger and a lot more organized. That night, I started keeping a meticulous log of every encounter, every bogus citation, every inspection that mysteriously popped onto my calendar. I also dug deeper into Karen's background. Turns out her husband, Robert Cromwell, wasn't just some small-time state worker. He was the Democratic Party treasurer, with access to zoning plans, development deals, and political favors across several counties. Normally, the mix of fresh coffee and morning lake air brought me peace. Now, it only reminded me how much I stood to lose. This wasn't about HOA fees anymore. It was about whether I'd become the next casualty in their cash grab scheme. Karen's next phase made everything so far look tame. When the red tape didn't push me out fast enough, she escalated to straight-up character assassination. It began with a Facebook post that made my stomach twist. Urgent safety concerns regarding aggressive behavior from a lakefront resident. Please keep children away from the Eastern Shore area. Filing for protective measures. Hashtag lakeside safety. Hashtag protect our kids. Aggressive behavior? Me? The same guy who'd spent years organizing the kids' annual fishing? For 15 straight years, I'd run the kids' fishing derby. Now, thanks to her post, within hours, I was branded a menace. It was shared 43 times, and the comments section exploded into a digital lynch mob. Strangers who had never even spoken to me declared I was unstable, dangerous, a threat. I always thought something was off about that man. Heard he threatened an HOA board member. Thank God for people like Delilah keeping us safe. The twisted part? Half the accounts posting were obvious fakes. Stock photo avatars, boilerplate names. Classic astroturfing, the kind political operatives use to make lies echo louder. Karen wasn't just spreading rumors, she was running a coordinated smear campaign. 2 days later, she filed for a restraining order. The petition, now part of public record, painted me as a volatile man making threats against HOA leaders. Total fiction. But facts didn't matter. The filing alone became proof in some minds. Judge Patricia Harris, who'd known my family for years, tossed it out immediately, citing lack of evidence. But the damage was already done. My name was now tied to the word threats in official court paperwork. The toll was grinding me down. I'd sit on Pop's porch at sunset, beer in hand, wondering if this fight was worth shattering the retirement I'd spent 3 decades earning. Even Pop's old leather recliner felt heavier now, less like comfort and more like the weight of a legacy someone was trying to erase. And then, just as I was near breaking, something shifted. The community began to push back. Judge Hendricks wasn't the only one who remembered my family. Retired Judge William Bill Carter, who used to fish with Pop in the 70s, appeared on my porch one morning with a thermos of coffee and a bit of hard-earned wisdom. "Marcus, that woman's playing a game your grandfather would have spotted a mile away. She's counting on you to feel isolated and overwhelmed. Don't give her that satisfaction." Bill leaned in and explained that harassment this organized usually pointed to bigger criminal games. Nobody goes to this much trouble over some neighborhood spat. There's money on the line, big money. Then something remarkable happened. The local VFW post, where I'd been a proud member for 20 years, issued a statement calling Karen's claims baseless attacks on a decorated community member. The Historical Society stepped in, emphasizing that my cabin was one of the last original structures on the lake, a piece of living heritage. Even the lake's environmental watchdog group praised my setup as a model for sustainable living. For the first time in months, I felt the tide shifting. The sharp taste of stress began to fade, replaced with something I hadn't felt in a while: hope. But Karen wasn't backing off, not even close. Her next move was cruel in its simplicity. Somehow, she got the utility company to investigate irregularities in my electrical service. For 3 days, I sat powerless while they tore apart my solar grid connection, looking for violations that didn't exist. Then came the false police reports. Suspicious activity at my cabin in broad daylight. Loud noises suggesting a domestic disturbance, even though I lived alone. Possible drug activity supposedly tied to the unusual number of visitors. Visitors who were nothing more than my old union buddies stopping by to show support. Each bogus call brought sheriff's deputies to my porch. Each pointless visit generated another incident report. And each report padded the growing file that painted me as a problem resident. The worst part? Deputy Chad Cromwell was almost always the one dispatched. He'd stroll up, ask a couple of half-hearted questions, then leave wearing a smug grin that told me he knew exactly what game his aunt was playing. During one especially surreal encounter, he actually leaned in and said, "You know, Mr. Henley, if you just apologized to my aunt and brought your property into compliance, all these issues would probably disappear." That's when it hit me. This wasn't even about me anymore. Karen was staging a public example. She was showing every homeowner on the lake what happened when you refused to bow to her authority. The Hendersons, the elderly couple who'd suddenly decided to sell, must have gone through this same ordeal. Soon, even the simple ping of my phone set off anxiety.
Every notification might mean another false complaint, another neighbor turning against me, another twist in Karen's psychological war. But buried among the noise were also messages of quiet support from folks I hadn't heard from in years. The battle was far from finished, but for the first time, I was starting to understand the rules of the game. The breakthrough came when I was stuck doing one of the dullest tasks possible, sorting through endless paperwork for my meeting with the Attorney General's office. Chuck had set the whole thing up, telling me they needed thorough documentation for their statewide HOA corruption probe. I sat at Pop's old oak table, buried in piles of citations, inspection reports, and legal threats, when something unusual caught my attention. One of Karen's violation letters had a tiny footer I'd never noticed before. Payments were directed to Lakeside Estates Community Improvement Fund, account number 84729. Community Improvement Fund. It looked official, but something about it didn't sit right with me. Maybe it was my decades of reading electrical contracts and catching the sneaky fine print contractors used to cheat homeowners. Either way, I decided to investigate further. By then, the county clerk's office felt like a second home, and Betty instantly knew what I was after when I asked about HOA financial documents. She pulled up the public filings and spread them across the counter like a card dealer. "Here's the deal, Marcus," she said, adjusting her glasses. "Homeowner associations are required to file yearly reports just like any other group. Let me show you what I uncovered." The numbers were a mess. Nothing matched. In just 2 years, the HOA had brought in $280,000 for lake dock repairs that were never carried out. Another $150,000 was supposedly spent on professional. The HOA's books listed landscaping work done by Cromwell Grounds and Maintenance, which state business records showed was owned by Karen's brother-in-law. But here's the twist. The company had only been created 3 weeks after Karen took over as HOA president. Pop's words echoed in my head. Always follow the money. When someone starts a business right after gaining authority, chances are it's a setup to funnel cash back to themselves. The insurance claims were even worse. In the last year and a half, the HOA had filed for storm damage reimbursement 3 separate times. The catch? I had been there through every single storm on this lake, and none of them caused the kind of destruction that could justify $95,000 in payouts. Betty helped me compare those claims against official National Weather Service reports. The timelines didn't line up. The HOA was reporting storm damage on days when the skies had been completely clear. "Marcus," Betty whispered, despite the fact that no one else was in the records room, "this looks like fraud, pure fraud." My hands trembled as I copied the documents, the crisp paper feeling like solid proof that could turn everything upside down. This wasn't simple harassment anymore. It was systematic theft from the whole lakeside community. And then came the last discovery. The HOA was paying $5,000 a month to an outfit called Clearwater Property Solutions for management services. But when I traced the business registration, all I found was a P.O. box in the same postal district where Karen lived. Suddenly, everything fell into place like the pins of a lock. Karen's campaign of harassment wasn't simply about authority or petty revenge. She had been methodically lowering property values to grease the wheels for a development plan, all while siphoning money from the community fund. Those older couples who'd been pressured to sell their cabins hadn't just been bullied out, they'd been forced to unload their homes for far less than they were worth, thanks to the fear she spread about declining property values. The mysterious cash buyers? Almost certainly tied to the same development group profiting from the stolen funds. I pictured the Hendersons scraping by in some cramped apartment, never realizing they'd been swindled twice. First when they sold their dream home for pennies, and again through the fees they unknowingly fed into Karen's secret slush account. The bitterness of my coffee had never cut so deep. This was no longer about defending my cabin. Karen had stolen from everyone, even from the neighbors she'd tricked into siding against me. Pop always warned that corruption runs deeper than you expect, and he'd been right. Karen wasn't just leading an HOA, she was operating a criminal racket. And I was preparing to deliver the evidence straight to the one person in the state with the power to end it for good. That night, I converted Pop's spare bedroom into what looked like a detective's war room. Maps of lakefront properties covered the walls, comparing original lots with Karen's inflated HOA claims. Every notification might mean another false complaint, another neighbor turning against me, another twist in Karen's psychological war. But buried among the noise were also messages of quiet support from folks I hadn't heard from in years. The battle was far from finished, but for the first time, I was starting to understand the rules of the game. The breakthrough came when I was stuck doing one of the dullest tasks possible, sorting through endless paperwork for my meeting with the Attorney General's office. Chuck had set the whole thing up, telling me they needed thorough documentation for their statewide HOA corruption probe. I sat at Pop's old oak table, buried in piles of citations, inspection reports, and legal threats, when something unusual caught my attention. One of Karen's violation letters had a tiny footer I'd never noticed before. Payments were directed to Lakeside Estates Community Improvement Fund, account number 84729. Community Improvement Fund. It looked official, but something about it didn't sit right with me. Maybe it was my decades of reading electrical contracts and catching the sneaky fine print contractors used to cheat homeowners. Either way, I decided to investigate further. By then, the county clerk's office felt like a second home, and Betty instantly knew what I was after when I asked about HOA financial documents. She pulled up the public filings and spread them across the counter like a card dealer. "Here's the deal, Marcus," she said, adjusting her glasses. "Homeowner associations are required to file yearly reports just like any other group. Let me show you what I uncovered." The numbers were a mess. Nothing matched. In just 2 years, the HOA had brought in $280,000 for lake dock repairs that were never carried out. Another $150,000 was supposedly spent on professional. The HOA's books listed landscaping work done by Cromwell Grounds and Maintenance, which state business records showed was owned by Karen's brother-in-law. But here's the twist. The company had only been created 3 weeks after Karen took over as HOA president. Pop's words echoed in my head, "Always follow the money." When someone starts a business right after gaining authority, chances are it's a setup to funnel cash back to themselves. The insurance claims were even worse. In the last year and a half, the HOA had filed for storm damage reimbursement 3 separate times. The catch? I had been there through every single storm on this lake, and none of them caused the kind of destruction that could justify $95,000 in payouts. Betty helped me compare those claims against official National Weather Service reports. The timelines didn't line up. The HOA was reporting storm damage on days when the skies had been completely clear. "Marcus," Betty whispered, despite the fact that no one else was in the records room, "this looks like fraud, pure fraud." My hands trembled as I copied the documents, the crisp paper feeling like solid proof that could turn everything upside down. This wasn't simple harassment anymore. It was systematic theft from the whole lakeside community. And then came the last discovery. The HOA was paying $5,000 a month to an outfit called Clearwater Property Solutions for management services. But when I traced the business registration, all I found was a P.O. box in the same postal district where Karen lived. Suddenly, everything fell into place like the pins of a lock. Karen's campaign of harassment wasn't simply about authority or petty revenge. She had been methodically lowering property values to grease the wheels for a development plan, all while siphoning money from the community fund. Those older couples who'd been pressured to sell their cabins hadn't just been bullied out, they'd been forced to unload their homes for far less than they were worth, thanks to the fear she spread about declining property values. The mysterious cash buyers? Almost certainly tied to the same development group profiting from the stolen funds. I pictured the Hendersons scraping by in some cramped apartment, never realizing they'd been swindled twice. First when they sold their dream home for pennies, and again through the fees they unknowingly fed into Karen's secret slush account. The bitterness of my coffee had never cut so deep. This was no longer about defending my cabin. Karen had stolen from everyone, even from the neighbors she'd tricked into siding against me. Pop always warned that corruption runs deeper than you expect, and he'd been right. Karen wasn't just leading an HOA, she was operating a criminal racket. And I was preparing to deliver the evidence straight to the one person in the state with the power to end it for good. That night, I converted Pop's spare bedroom into what looked like a detective's war room. Maps of lakefront properties covered the walls, comparing original lots with Karen's inflated HOA claims.
My union training kicked in. When you're managing a complicated project, you plan for every possible scenario and make sure redundancies are in place. We had contingency plans stacked on top of contingency plans. The trap was ready. Karen's behavior had become so predictable, we could practically script her next move. All we needed was for her to make her usual dramatic entrance, and she didn't disappoint. It was as if she sensed the noose tightening. Her tactics shifted from calculated intimidation to outright sabotage. Watching her was like seeing a trapped animal thrash in panic, more reckless and more dangerous with every passing day. The first sign came when my solar panels mysteriously failed one Tuesday morning. I woke to drained batteries and error codes flashing across the inverter screen. My electrician friend Jake came over to inspect and immediately spotted signs of tampering. Wires had been loosened just enough to cripple the system without leaving obvious damage. "Marcus, this is professional-level sabotage," Jake said, snapping photos with his phone. "Whoever did this understands electrical systems. They wanted disruption without leaving clear fingerprints." But Jake was sharper than Karen ever imagined. After that first incident, Jake set up a hidden security camera near the electrical panel. Just 2 nights later, it paid off. We caught her in the act. At 3 a.m., there was Karen, crouched on my property with a screwdriver and a pair of wire cutters. The footage was undeniable. Karen Cromwell, HOA president and so-called pillar of the community, sneaking around under cover of night to sabotage private property. Even the bitter scent of her cigarette smoke clung to the air the next morning, tainting the pine fragrance that usually brought me peace. Then she escalated. I came back from a grocery run to find my boat drifting in the middle of the lake. The heavy chains I'd used to lock it in place had been sliced through with bolt cutters, leaving neat cuts and a scatter of metal shavings on the dock boards. That boat wasn't just a vessel. It had been Pop's pride, a 1978 bass boat that still purred like a dream. Seeing it scratched up on the far shore felt like someone had spit on his memory. But Karen's worst move came when she went after my septic system. I'd just passed county inspection without a single issue, yet suddenly the whole thing started backing up. The smell was unbearable, a mix of raw sewage and harsh chemicals that burned your eyes even from 50 feet away. When the emergency septic crew showed up, they discovered someone had dumped industrial-strength drain cleaner into the system, killing off the good bacteria and leaving behind a toxic sludge. "This is deliberate sabotage," the technician said, lifting soil samples that revealed heavy chemical contamination. "Somebody poured commercial-grade acids into your lines. This stuff isn't cheap, and it takes specialized knowledge to handle." The repairs cost me $3,200, but the real value was the forensic proof, evidence that this wasn't random mischief, but calculated destruction by someone who understood septic systems. While I battled sewage backups, Karen was waging war on another front, the media. Suddenly, anonymous accounts swarmed social platforms, with posts claiming my property was riddled with violations and posed a danger to the neighborhood. The fakery was laughable. Dozens of cookie-cutter profiles with generic names, all posting the same accusations within minutes of each other. At the same time, her intimidation machine went into overdrive. Deputy Chad Cromwell's patrol car became a near-constant fixture, crawling past my cabin 4 or 5 times a day, slowing just enough to make sure I noticed. Sometimes he'd park in my driveway for 20 minutes, running plates on every visitor. Then, out of nowhere, the building inspector began. The building inspector suddenly discovered code violations in projects that had passed inspection only weeks earlier. The fire marshal began fielding anonymous tips about non-existent hazards. Environmental Services received bogus reports of illegal dumping in spots they'd already cleared. It was death by 1,000 paper cuts, an endless barrage of bureaucracy meant to drain my wallet and crush my will. And I wasn't the only one in her crosshairs anymore. Karen began targeting my allies, too. Jake's electrical license was abruptly flagged for safety violations. Bill Carter, the retired judge who had been advising me, was slapped with a complaint to the state bar for allegedly offering improper legal counsel. The VFW Post suddenly faced a surprise fire inspection that threatened to cancel their weekly bingo. Even the Historical Society got hit with zoning grievances against their downtown office. The pattern was unmistakable. Anyone who dared support me became the next target. The psychological pressure was relentless. Each day brought fresh crises, new emergencies, another round of bureaucratic harassment. Stress left a metallic taste in my mouth, as routine as my morning coffee. Yet Karen's reckless escalation was also backfiring. Law enforcement was now documenting every move. Each act of sabotage became another brick in the case against her. And slowly, her network of loyalists began to peel away as her conduct grew. Karen was unraveling fast. The Attorney General's office monitored every move, quietly stacking evidence while she kept digging her own grave with each act of retaliation.
Agent Torres called it classic escalation. Corner a criminal, and they start making rash choices that practically gift-wrap the prosecution's case. Karen was stumbling right into the snare we'd set, one sabotaged solar panel at a time. But then she made her boldest move yet, and for a moment it nearly worked. Through her husband's political ties, she'd learned that my meetings weren't with just any state bureaucrat. They were with Attorney General Patricia Williamson herself. Instead of retreating, Karen doubled down. Her scheme was twisted but almost genius. Cast herself as the victim of a political witch hunt. By claiming that the state's highest prosecutor was targeting her family for partisan gain, she could flip the script entirely. All she needed was footage of herself confronting government corruption at my cabin, and she'd recast herself as a fearless whistleblower taking on abuse of power. The first hints of her strategy appeared online. Karen had reached out to Government Accountability Watch, one of those activist-style blog networks that thrive on stories of bureaucratic abuse. Her pitch was slick. A small-town HOA president being persecuted by big government because her husband belonged to the rival political party. Local family under attack. State officials weaponize harassment probe to silence opposition, was the headline that began circulating just 3 days before my scheduled meeting. The article cast me as some shadowy operative colluding with corrupt prosecutors to ruin an innocent family. The comment sections exploded with outrage from strangers who had never heard of our lake, but were suddenly convinced Karen was being crushed by partisan politics. She'd tapped into the deep anti-government streak that runs strong in rural communities, painting herself as a martyr for political freedom. But her boldest move was the live stream setup. She had arranged to broadcast her showdown with the Attorney General across social media, framing it as grassroots journalism, a citizen exposing corruption in real time. Her plan was to storm into my cabin mid-meeting, capture everything on camera, and unleash it online as proof of state misconduct. What she didn't realize was, what Karen didn't know, was that we had been monitoring her communications the whole time. Agent Torres had secured warrants for her phone records and social media weeks earlier. We already knew about the blogger outreach, the live stream stunt, even the scripted talking points she planned to use during her supposedly spontaneous ambush. "It's actually perfect," Torres said at our final prep meeting. "She's about to commit multiple felonies on live video while handing us a real-time confession of her intent. You couldn't write it better." The irony was almost too good. Karen thought she was setting a trap for us, when in reality she was about to star in the most thoroughly documented arrest in HOA history. Meanwhile, her foundation was crumbling beneath her feet, though she was too blinded by obsession to see it. The other board members had quietly stepped away once the financial red flags became undeniable. Her husband was now facing his own ethics probe and could no longer shield her politically. Even Deputy Chad had been reassigned to other beats after Internal Affairs started poking around his suspicious handling of vandalism reports. But Karen was long past rational thought. The strain of hiding her embezzlement while fending off multiple investigations had cracked her composure. She was showing all the textbook signs of collapse, paranoid about neighbors spying, making increasingly hostile calls to anyone who dared support me, and convinced, Karen had convinced herself that everyone was part of some grand conspiracy against her. The night before the Attorney General's arrival, she made threatening phone calls to 4 different families, warning them of consequences if they kept collaborating with government harassment. Each call was captured by law enforcement. Each one became another piece of evidence for witness intimidation and criminal conspiracy. I spent that evening on Pop's porch, watching the sunset bleed gold and crimson across the lake. The calls of loons echoing over the water reminded me exactly why this fight mattered. Tomorrow would decide everything. Whether I could spend my retirement enjoying quiet nights here, or whether I'd spend it locked in battle with Karen's endless appeals from federal prison. The cabin felt different, not only because of the hidden microphones and cameras tucked into every corner, but because it had become the center of something much bigger than a property dispute. This was about proving that small-time crooks with political ties couldn't terrorize entire communities and get away with it. I pulled out Pop's weathered leather Bible and reread the passage he'd underlined about David facing Goliath. In the margin, he'd scribbled, "Sometimes the little guy wins because he's fighting for something greater than himself." The next morning would bring Karen's last desperate play. She'd march through my door certain she was about to crush her enemies without realizing she was about to destroy herself. The trap was set. The cameras were rolling. Law enforcement was in place. All that remained was for Karen to deliver the grand finale of her own criminal saga. The mix of anticipation and morning coffee had never tasted sweeter. Attorney General Patricia Williamson wasn't at all what I had pictured. Instead of a stern political heavyweight, she turned out to be a down-to-earth woman in her 50s who reminded me of my old high school principal, firm but fair, with eyes that missed nothing. She arrived at my cabin precisely at 9 a.m., carrying a thermos of coffee and a briefcase stuffed with evidence that could change everything. "Mr. Henley," she said, settling into Pop's worn recliner as if it were her own, "your records have helped us build cases against HOA corruption networks in 6 counties. What you've uncovered here isn't just local misconduct, it's part of a statewide system of organized theft." We were deep in conversation about potential charges when the sound hit us, the unmistakable roar of Karen's Escalade barreling into my driveway. Gravel flew like shrapnel from a high-speed chase. Car doors slammed. Voices shouted about camera angles and audio feeds. Karen had shown up with her full social media crew, ready to stage her moment of glory. "Showtime," Agent Torres whispered into her earpiece from behind my woodshed. Attorney General Williamson didn't so much as blink. She just kept jotting notes on the financial evidence while Karen's voice rose outside, winding herself into a frenzy for her live stream audience. "This is it, folks," Karen shouted, her words carrying clearly through my windows. "We're about to reveal the corruption targeting our family. The state's attorney general is secretly meeting with our harasser to plan more persecution." The sharp staccato of her designer heels pounding across my porch sounded like a countdown clock to her own downfall. Then, crash! The door blew inward as if she'd used a battering ram instead of her foot. Wood splinters scattered everywhere. The Attorney General's coffee mug shattered against the floor, the crash punctuating the chaos like a cymbal strike. Karen stormed into the living room with her phone raised high, broadcasting live, blind to the fact that she had just committed trespassing, breaking and entering, and assault, all in front of the state's top prosecutor. "I demand to know why the Attorney General is conspiring with this man," she shrieked, brandishing her phone as if it were a weapon. "This is harassment, political persecution. I have rights." The look on her face when Attorney General Williamson calmly stood and held out her official credentials was beyond priceless. Karen's stream recorded the exact instant her mind caught up with reality, pure, frozen terror. "Mrs. Cromwell," the Attorney General said, her voice calm, steady, and lethal, the kind of tone that could make seasoned criminals fold. "I am Patricia Williamson, Attorney General of this state. You have just committed multiple felonies in my presence, and your entire outburst is being recorded both by my office and your own live broadcast." Karen's phone kept streaming, her audience watching in real time as their so-called whistleblower unraveled into a rambling wreck. The comment feed lit up with disbelief and chaos as viewers realized they'd been backing a fraud who had just imploded on camera. This is my community. I have jurisdiction here," Karen stuttered, clinging to the delusion that her HOA badge outranked state law. That's when Agent Torres entered, flanked by 2 federal officers, her presence sharp as a blade. "Mrs. Cromwell, you are under arrest for fraud, extortion, witness intimidation, and criminal harassment. And thanks to your live stream, you've confessed in front of roughly 3,000 witnesses." The metallic snap of the cuffs closing rang through the cabin like the final sentence of a long story. Karen's phone slipped from her hand, hitting the floor, still recording, still broadcasting her downfall. Her supporters now silent, watching in shock as their heroine became nothing more than a criminal caught in the act. Watching her unravel in public was almost surreal. "Karen," I said, rising from Pop's old couch with a grin I didn't bother to hide, "allow me to introduce you to the state's Attorney General. She's been very curious about your bookkeeping skills." The neighbors, drawn out by the chaos, clustered on my porch in hushed disbelief as the woman who had bullied us for months was formally read her Miranda rights in my own living room. Mrs. Patterson, who'd come all the way back from her daughter's house just to see this day, wept openly, tears streaming down her cheeks. Sheriff Rodriguez arrived just in time to escort Karen on her humiliating walk of shame, handcuffed, stumbling past the dock she tried to destroy, the solar panels she called unsafe, the cabin she labeled an eyesore. Her pristine pearl-white Escalade, with its smug Rule 1 vanity plates, was hauled away as evidence of fraud. The live stream ended with Karen's defiant shriek echoing across the lake. "This isn't over! My husband will fix this! You don't know who you're dealing with!" But we did. We knew exactly who she was, a criminal, and criminals belong in prison. Watching Judge Michael Harrison sentence her 3 months later was pure vindication. He didn't just drop the book on her, he practically launched the whole library. 3 years in federal prison, $340,000 in restitution to her victims, and a lifetime ban from ever serving on any HOA board again. HOA board anywhere in the United States. Her husband, Robert, didn't escape either. The ethics probe uncovered that he'd been abusing his role as party treasurer to leak insider details on zoning shifts and upcoming development projects. He stepped down in disgrace and was sentenced to 18 months for conspiracy and misuse of office. The HOA itself collapsed faster than sugar dissolving in hot coffee. In its place, we built the Clearwater Lake Volunteer Association, volunteer being the key word. No forced dues, no bogus fines, no petty tyrants, just neighbors pitching in to keep our corner of the world beautiful. My part in unraveling the scheme earned me something I'd never even thought about: whistleblower compensation from the funds the government clawed back. Apparently, if you help recover hundreds of thousands in stolen money, Uncle Sam cuts you in. That $45,000 check was sweet proof that every sleepless night Karen caused hadn't been for nothing. But the true reward was watching justice ripple through the community. Attorney General Williamson used our case as the backbone for new state legislation that still feels surreal to me. It carries my name. The Henley Act requires every HOA to undergo yearly independent financial audits and establishes criminal penalties for harassment-driven property schemes. Our evidence sparked prosecutions in 3 other counties, exposing similar fraud rings. As it turned out, Karen's scam was only one piece of a much larger web of politically connected criminals siphoning money from homeowners across rural America. The FBI's final report documented over 24 linked cases across 5 states. Families who had been forced out began returning. The Hendersons purchased a new cabin just 2 lots away after their old property's fraudulent stigma was erased. Mrs. Patterson came back from Florida and threw a lakeside block party that lasted until dawn. Property values didn't just recover, they soared. Turns out, when you eliminate harassment and phony citations, people line up to live in a quiet, thriving lakeside community. Who could have guessed? The change went far beyond court victories. Our little lake became a model for cooperative, sustainable living. My off-grid cabin, once condemned as an eyesore, now hosts monthly tours for folks curious about solar power and sustainable living. The state's environmental agency even spotlighted us in their Renewable Energy Showcase program. I used part of my whistleblower reward to create the Pops Legacy Scholarship, $500 grants for kids heading into trade schools.
Pop always believed that honest work with your hands was the foundation of a good life, so it felt right to help the next generation carry that forward. Our annual Clearwater Lake Festival has grown into a regional highlight, raising money for veteran housing programs. Just last year, we raised enough to build 3 tiny homes for homeless vets. The smell of barbecue and the sound of families laughing now fill the air where Karen's poison once lingered. But the best part is the stillness. Right now, I'm on Pop's porch, watching the sunset spill gold and purple across the water. Loons call to one another,
their cries bouncing off the same hills where Pop taught me to fish 6 decades ago. My solar panels hum quietly on the roof, powering a life that finally belongs to me again. No more certified letters, no more surprise inspections, no more designer heels clacking on my dock at dawn. Just the steady rhythm of waves against the old wood, and the reminder that sometimes, if you're stubborn enough and stand on the right side of things, David really can take down Goliath. A Netflix crew wrapped filming here just last month. HOA Hell, How One Man Took Down a Criminal Empire is set to premiere next spring. They paid me enough to build a guest cabin where other victims of HOA harassment can stay while fighting their own battles. Because Karen wasn't some anomaly. There are power-hungry HOA tyrants all over the country, bullying seniors and draining community coffers. But now there's a blueprint for pushing back. And I want to hear from you. Share your HOA nightmare in the comments. You're not alone in this fight. These stories need a spotlight. Hit subscribe if you want more tales about ordinary people taking down corrupt systems, because we've got plenty more. Next week, I'll tell you about the city councilman who tried to shut down a veteran's food truck until the owner's Pentagon buddies decided to stop by. Thanks for watching HOA Stories, where the Karens of the world finally meet their match. If this one had you cheering, groaning, or both, leave a comment, smash that like button, and subscribe so you don't miss the next outrageous HOA saga.